So, having established his credibility as an Enlightenment thinker in this discussion of the oceanic feeling, Freud goes on to talk about why the only thing you can really look at scientifically is the pleasure principle. And here he's really identifying himself in certain ways with utilitarianism and the calculus of pleasure. He wants to move away from any big questions of the purpose of life. Remember that from early in the book, that the purpose of life for individuals is just reducing suffering and seeking pleasure. I mean, he doesn't really want to get into any other large stories about the meaning or purpose of life. And instead, what Freud wants to talk about are what he calls the three sources of suffering. Remember this, the three sources of suffering are our own body, the external world, and other people. And for Freud, it's really important to face the sources of suffering. I think this, and we need to spend a little time on why that's the case. He says that so many other writers, whether they're religious writers or philosophical writers or politicians, social commentators, what they really want to do is, instead of facing what really causes us sorrow and pain, they want actually to give us consolation. And Freud is one of those thinkers, we can call him Stoic, I guess, in this way. He said, consolation is not what we should pursue. Consolation is an awful thing, really, for Freud, because it disguises where our suffering comes from and makes it harder for us to deal with these sources of suffering. Freud writes in the edition we use in this class on page 22, life as we find it is too hard for us. It brings us too many pains, disappointments, and impossible tasks. In order to bear it, we cannot dispense with palliative measures, right? Palliative measures. So we come up with these almost like drugs, so we don't have to deal with life as it really is. Freud sees what he's doing in Civilization's Discontents as poking through some of the palliative measures which wind up causing us even more suffering. Some of the illusions we give ourselves to make ourselves feel better, but actually which those illusions make things worse for us. So in order to do that, Freud has to make the analogy between the individual psyche that he's been studying most of his career and society. And he says on page 44 in our edition, we cannot fail to be struck by the similarity between the process of civilization and the libidinal development of the individual. It is impossible to overlook the extent to which civilization is built upon a renunciation of instinct, how much it presupposes precisely the non-satisfaction of powerful instincts. Here is a core of Freud's understanding, that civilization is based on the renunciation of instinct. For Freud, that is okay, if you will, but it doesn't work. When you renounce instinct, when you repress things, they come out in other ways. Nietzsche says much the same thing. So Freud takes his Oedipus complex, and you know the Oedipus complex at the level of the individual is that the boy or the girl desires to be with the mother and desires to eliminate the father. Be with the mother, Freud says, Roth, you're being euphemistically, I said, has sex with the mother. That's Freud's view, that we have a desire for incest, whether we're boys or girls, to be with the mother, the originary caregiver, and that we have this desire to get rid of the father. Boys and girls act differently in relation to the father, but they both have this desire for the primary giver of life, the mother. And that has to be renounced. That has to be pushed away, that primary desire. And for Freud, at the level of society, he has a story of the primal horde, where a big, strong alpha male is, controlling the horde, this troop of proto-humans, and keeping all the other males from having sex with it, unless the chief guy says you can reproduce with that person or not, or the chief guy just says, no, nobody else can have sex but me. And Freud says that chief guy one day will be killed by all the brothers who are frustrated by the alpha male's power. They band together and kill him. But once they kill him, they feel guilty because in some way he was their father, and they themselves institute prohibitions against incest to renounce this primary desire. Freud doesn't insist on the story. You can read it in Civilization as Discontent. He thinks of it as almost like a myth to organize his understanding of society. What it does is it gives him a story for talking about how civilization creates rules against what we want. Freud says somewhere that there's no rule against putting your hand in the fire, because you don't want to put your hand in the fire. You have rules against incest because people really want incest. You have rules against coveting your neighbor's wife because people want to covet. You have rules against the things you want to do. And these rules exist out of a civilizing function that, in order to have peace in society, in order to have some security, renounces desire, renounces instinct. Freud thinks that you do need some of that renunciation. He's not a thinker who says, let's let it all go and everybody should be free and do whatever the heck they want. No, Freud is a good, solid, bourgeois doctor. He doesn't think that we should that we would be better off if everybody acted on their impulses. But he does think that the civilizing process has gotten to a point where it has renounced our desires so much that they explode in awful, pathological, excessive ways. He's clearly writing after World War I, when there was such enormous suffering, tens of millions of people who were killed or wounded or died in the aftermath of the First World War. For Freud, this explosion of violence is related to the fact that we deny that we have a desires for aggression. I have to say a little bit more about that because so far we've just been talking about sexuality. But by the second decade of the 20th century, Freud has begun to think that not only do we have a desire for sex, that we also have a desire that he calls aggressive, or sometimes he calls it the death instinct. That's the desire for sexuality. Freud says is the desire to combine, link things together, put things together. But we also have a desire to break things apart, to smash things, to divide things. This is the desire. This is desire for aggression, or the aggressive instinct. And for Freud, our moral codes deny sex through the prohibitions on incest, through sexual morality, which he thinks is really hypocritical most of the time, and a denial of aggression. And if you bottle up, things explode.
When you get in the way of pleasure, it's a problem because that will lead to aggression. When you get in the way of pleasure, people will try to get their pleasures in other ways, through aggression. This is Nietzsche's view too. So then you get in the way of aggression. So you can't have professional wrestling on Andrews Field. You can't have no fisticuffs in class. No, I don't know. You start limiting opportunities for aggression. And for Freud, the more you limit the opportunities for aggression, the more you bottle up an impulse that will at some point explode. It's not that he thinks we should be hitting each other, all right, or getting into fisticuffs, but he does think that the denial of the pleasure we get from aggression, the denial of that pleasure will lead us actually to have more either internal aggression, guilt, or to create explosive aggression in mass war.
And so Freud spends a lot of time in Civilization as Discontents on the denial of aggression. What does civilization demand of us? Freud asks in Civilization as Discontent. It demands in morality that we love our neighbors. And Freud says this is impossible. It's impossible because we actually like to see our neighbors suffer. That's something that's gratifying. And denying that will, in the end, cause more suffering. And here is very much like Nietzsche. He says, because every time you have people say, well, love your neighbor, be kind to strangers, all that, you always find some scapegoat that you can take your rage out on. For he thinks every time you ask people to be sweet and kind, as a rule, they will find something to attack. They will find an enemy. They'll find a scapegoat. They'll find some group of people that they can vent their aggression on. And he's thinking of the Jews. Freud is a Jew himself, a secular Jew, but very much identifies as a Jewish person. And he says on page 61 in our edition, he's kind of very, in a comic or ironic tone, I should say. He says, in this respect, the Jewish people scattered everywhere have rendered the most useful services to the civilizations of the countries that have been their hosts. But unfortunately, all the massacres of the Jews in the Middle Ages did not suffice to make that period more peaceful and secure for their Christian fellows. Here, Freud is taking a page out of Nietzsche, saying, listen, these Christian moralists who say we have to be kind to everybody and love everybody, what they then do is they vent their rage on the Jews and massacre them. And Freud says, well, the Jews have provided this service because the Christians have to get their rage out somewhere. But of course, he's mocking the hypocrisy of neighborly love and morality by saying you always need a scapegoat. The other thing he insists on in Civilization is Discontents is that we also turn our aggression inward. Not only do we find scapegoats out there that we can hate, we can attack, like the Jews, like people we colonize or people we consider an other, right? Whether they're racial others, sexual others, people we think are beneath contempt, that we are allowed to rage against them or beneath morality. Not only do we do that, but Freud says that in Civilization is Discontents, that we turn our aggression inward. That is, we're not allowed to express it enough. There aren't enough, forgive me for putting it this way, but in Freud's time, there aren't enough Jews around. There aren't enough people to attack that we're allowed to attack. So we turn our aggression inward. And the turning of aggression inward, as you've learned from Nietzsche, is guilt. And what Freud sees is the increase in guilt. As we become more civilized, we have more and more occasions to feel we're not living up to our ideals. We have more and more occasions to turn against ourselves, to become twisted and racked by guilt because we're not living up to the expectations we've created for ourselves. We're not studying enough, we're not working hard enough, we're not making enough money, we're not being kind enough, whatever the ideal is. And Freud thinks that this, again, bottles up impulse, which will eventually, poof, explode, as it did in World War I, in murderous rage.